You're watching Light Behind Bars, where real crime meets powerful redemption. Every story here is inspired by true events brought to life through deep emotion and fiction. If you're ready to explore the human side of justice, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell, because some stories deserve to be heard, not forgotten. As night descended upon Oslo, it was not the gentle darkness that cradled the city into slumber, but a cold, invisible fog, slithering through every alley, seeping into every window, where streetlights cast a feeble, jaundiced glow beneath the serene facade of a prosperous Nordic nation, seemingly woven with snowflakes and fairy tales. A toxic seed had quietly sprouted, unnoticed, unknown. That seed bore the name Anders Behring Breivik, a name that would later become synonymous with terror, with blood and tears, with an indelible dark chapter in Norway's history. Anders was born on a frigid February day in 1979 in an Oslo hospital, cradled in the arms of a young mother and a father already fading from the picture. The marriage of his parents, Vensje Behring and Jens Breivik, a diplomat, had fractured long before his first cry pierced the air. His birth certificate bore his mother's surname, an early omen of the father's absence through much of his tender years. A mere year later, the divorce was finalized. Jens relocated to Paris with a new wife, leaving Vensje to navigate life alone with Anders and her daughter from a previous marriage. It was an imperfect beginning, a family shattered like a mirror, each fragment reflecting a solitary, chilling gleam. Anders's early years unfolded in a modest apartment in Oslo's middle-class west side. Vensje, his mother, was described as a woman of instability, sometimes depressed, sometimes smotheringly overprotective, even stifling. Whispers circulated that she had once considered abortion, a fleeting thought that cast an uneasy shadow, an intangible rejection. The bond between mother and son was fraught, like a taut string on the verge of snapping. She loved him in her own distorted way, a love lacking the warmth and understanding needed to nurture a fragile soul. From a tender age, Anders displayed unusual traits. He wasn't the typically boisterous, mischievous child. Instead, he was distant, drawn to solitary games, and often defiant in an oddly provocative manner. By age 4, child welfare services received troubling reports about him. Social workers noted Vensje's struggles to manage her young son, describing Anders as anxious, fearful of contact, with a false, inscrutable smile and passively provocative behaviors. A psychologist at the time labeled him a child without boundaries, his mother depressed, and the family at risk of severe neglect or worse. A proposal surfaced to place Anders in foster care, removing him from his mother's unsteady care, for reasons unclear. That plan never materialized. The seed remained in its bleak soil, drawing nourishment from the gloom. The absence of a strong, stable father figure left a gaping void in Anders's soul. Jens Breivik, despite sporadic attempts at contact, was a faint, distant shadow. Brief visits couldn't fill the daily emptiness. Anders craved his father's recognition, his validation, but received only indifference or hollow promises, perhaps from this lack. He began crafting an inner world, a realm where he was the center, the one in control, compensating for the powerlessness of his reality. As a teenager, Anders' rebellion grew more pronounced, yet calculated. He joined a graffiti crew, a minor act of lawlessness that gave him a sense of belonging, a stage to flaunt his burgeoning ego. He wasn't the leader, but strove to stand out. A strange duality defined him: a desire to fit in, to be accepted, clashed with a hunger to be different, superior, even if through negative means. Light and shadow intertwined, painting his psyche in eerie, discordant hues. Friends from his youth described Anders as smug, craving the spotlight, yet lacking genuine empathy. He could be friendly, sociable, but behind it lay an icy wall, a cold calculation. He obsessed over appearances, curating a flawless image with designer clothes and bodybuilding to sculpt a powerful physique. It was as if he sought to mask the insecurities and deep fissures within. He was an actor on life's stage, playing a role not truly his own, a performance growing ever more alien to his human core. No single tragic event can be pinpointed as the sole catalyst for Anders' descent into evil. Rather, It was a slow accumulation, tiny cracks widening and deepening until the entire structure of his psyche collapsed. It was the loneliness within his own home, the sense of abandonment, of rejection, the failure to forge emotional connections with others, an ego inflated to pathological extremes, the influence of the environment, the extremist ideologies he began to encounter as he grew. Each factor was a drop of water, slowly filling the glass until it overflowed, sweeping everything away. People often seek clear signs, blatant warnings, but in Anders, the abnormality hid beneath a veneer of normalcy, even success in certain arenas. He wasn't the stereotypical societal outcast. He was educated, pursued business ventures, and had an attractive appearance. This fabricated normalcy made his eventual eruption all the more horrific and perplexing. Darkness doesn't always manifest as a grotesque monster. Sometimes, it lurks in a smile, a glance, a gesture that seems harmless. The first seeds were sown: the isolation, the anxiety, the yearning for attention, the absence of love and proper guidance all mingled, creating fertile ground for the dark thoughts that would later take root and flourish. The light of childhood, if it ever existed, was but a faint flicker, too weak to dispel the encroaching shadows in his young mind. Norway slumbered on, unaware of the storm brewing within one of its own, a tempest that would soon sweep through, leaving scars that would never heal. Silence. Only the silence of a soul slipping into darkness, a silence more terrifying than any scream, as time swept forward, carrying the fragments of an incomplete childhood. Anders stepped into adulthood, burdened not only by the vague ambitions of youth, but also by an increasingly inflated ego and a simmering resentment toward the world around him. His business failures, which he always tried to varnish with grandiose words, and the shallow social connections that failed to fill the profound loneliness within, spread like an oil slick, seeping into the already barren soil of his soul. He sought meaning, a grand purpose to explain the turmoil inside and the emptiness he felt. And then, in the shadows of the digital world, amid the endless streams of information and anonymous forums, he found it a radical ideology, a warped explanation for everything. This was no spiritual awakening in any positive sense, no belief guiding one toward the light of love and compassion. Instead, it was a slow poisoning, a betrayal of the very humanistic values that Norwegian society, where he was born and raised, prided itself on. Anders immersed himself in the writings, essays, and online debates of far-right groups, those fueled by hatred for immigrants, Islamophobia, and a perverse obsession with the decline of Western culture. Like a sponge, he absorbed their venomous rhetoric, conspiracy theories of a silent Islamic invasion, and the betrayal of multicultural political elites. His personal grievances, feelings of failure and being undervalued now found a megaphone, an easy scapegoat. It was no longer his fault, no longer his shortcomings. It was them Muslims, immigrants, cultural Marxists, feminists, those destroying the pure European heritage he and his ideological allies fancied themselves as defenders of. The ideals he embraced were not about creation, but destruction. His belief was not hope, but despair draped in the guise of salvation. He began to see the world through a distorted lens, warped by hatred and fear. Oslo, his hometown, was no longer the peaceful city of lush parks and friendly faces. In his eyes, it was tainted, invaded by foreign cultures and alien values. Every Muslim woman in a hijab, every mosque built, every multicultural policy became evidence of the decay he despised. Real social issues, like the struggles of some immigrants to integrate, were not met with objective analysis or constructive solutions. Instead, he exaggerated, scapegoated, and weaponized them to justify his ideology. The light of reason and empathy was gradually eclipsed by the darkness of fanaticism. He lost the ability to engage in dialogue or entertain opposing views. Anyone who disagreed was an enemy, a traitor. He built a fortress of isolation around himself, admitting only voices that echoed his extremism. The internet became his sanctuary, where he found validation from anonymous strangers, lost souls like him, united in hatred and deranged plans. The spiritual trauma Anders underwent was not a betrayal of traditional religious faith. He wasn't a devout believer deceived. Instead, He crafted his own perverse religion, a diseased creed with extremist historical figures as saints, violence as ritual, and a holy war to protect an imagined Europe as its ultimate goal. He saw himself as a modern Knight Templar, a lone warrior against the world, a messiah chosen by destiny for a sacred mission. His delusions of grandeur and self-importance grew ever more warped and dangerous. He spent thousands of hours studying history not to learn from it, but to twist it, seeking evidence to prop up his prejudices. He read about the Crusades and religious wars, not with a critical eye, but with admiration for their violence and dominance. The blood of the past seemed to soak the pages he read, staining his thoughts crimson. The tears of history's innocent victims didn't move him, they only hardened his resolve. The silence in the small room where he lived, hunched over his computer day and night, was not the silence of peace, but the hush of a storm gathering strength. Outside, life went on. People laughed, loved, hoped, but within Anders' mind, another world was taking shape, one of darkness and destruction. He no longer connected to reality in any normal way. He lived in a parallel universe where his warped ideals were the only truth, and violence the only answer. This transformation didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual erosion, like cancer eating away at the body, from vague discontent to finding an explanation, then accepting it as undeniable truth, and finally, a readiness to act to make that truth real. Each step sank him deeper into the quagmire of extremism. His prayers, if any, were not for peace or forgiveness, but whispers to demons, pleas for strength to commit atrocities. His ideals, now thoroughly twisted, turned a seemingly ordinary young man into a latent monster. His hatred of multiculturalism was no longer a political stance, but an obsession, a driving force, a reason to exist. He no longer saw humanity in those different from him only symbols of invasion, targets to eliminate. The last flickers of his humanity seemed to have died, replaced by a thick, frigid darkness ready to drown everything in a sea of blood. Any inner conflict, if it existed, was silenced by an iron will and a blind faith in the bloody mission he had assigned himself. The warped ideology had taken deep root in Anders' mind, and now it demanded action. His dark thoughts were no longer confined to the virtual realm of extremist forums or the pages of the deranged manifesto he was secretly drafting. They began to seep into the real world, shaping decisions, forming concrete plans. The darkness was no longer just an internal state. It sought a physical form, a vessel to unleash its destructive power. Anders' first criminal act, in the sense of preparing for a greater atrocity, was not a spontaneous robbery or assault. It was a calculated, chilling step in a meticulously planned scheme, one he believed would alter history, would awaken Europe. He needed money, vast sums, to fund his war, his earlier business ventures. Despite his efforts to embellish them, had failed to provide enough resources. Anders turned to illegal means, but not as a common street criminal. He leveraged his intelligence and patience to orchestrate sophisticated financial fraud. He set up shell companies, used false identities, and exploited system loopholes to siphon funds. Every krone gained through these shady dealings was not for personal luxuries, but treated as ammunition, raw materials for the weapons of his crusade. This criminal behavior, though bloodless, marked a critical turning point. It signified crossing yet another moral line. He justified using illegal means for a higher purpose, rationalizing deceit and fraud as tools. The light of honesty and integrity was wholly consumed by the darkness of conspiracy and deception. He moved cautiously in the underworld of financial crime, covering his tracks, crafting a veneer of legitimacy for his illicit activities, alongside raising funds. Anders began researching and acquiring materials to build bombs and weapons. He spent hours online, studying chemicals, explosive techniques, and firearms in an ordinary person's hands. Such knowledge might be mere scientific curiosity. In Anders, it became the arsenal of death. He ordered fertilizers and industrial chemicals from various sources, using his front companies to deflect suspicion. Each delivered package, each paid invoice, brought him closer to the day of horror. He also pursued a firearms license. Norway's gun laws were strict, but Anders, with his patience and acting skills, navigated the checks. He joined a shooting club, trained regularly, and cultivated the image of a lawful sports shooting enthusiast. No one at the club could suspect that the skills he honed were not for competition, but for slaughter. He mastered rifles, handguns, precision aiming, and rapid reloading. Each bullet that hit the target affirmed his steely resolve. The blood and tears of the future were foreshadowed in those cold practice sessions. The remote farm he rented in Rena, hours from Oslo, provided the perfect cover for his criminal activities, surrounded by fields and forests. He had the space and privacy to conduct experiments and build the massive bomb he planned to deploy. Neighbors, if any, saw only a diligent young man seemingly running an agricultural business. They could never imagine that inside the barn, chemicals were being mixed, detonators assembled. A horrifying contrast emerged between the outward tranquility and the terror brewing within. This first criminal act, the preparation for a larger crime, set Anders on an irreversible path. He had invested too much time, effort, and money into his plan. His ego was irrevocably tied to this mission. Any hesitation or doubt was swiftly dismissed. He isolated himself from external influences that might sway his resolve. Cutting off most old friends and limiting family contact, his world shrank, encompassing only the plan and his delusions of a future he would shape. Perhaps, in the solitary moments at the farm, amid chemical barrels and bomb schematics, fleeting fears or faint awareness of the monstrosity of his actions surfaced. But the darkness of his fanaticism was too powerful. It smothered any whisper of conscience, any inner turmoil. He convinced himself that violence was necessary, that the sacrifice of innocence was unavoidable collateral damage for a greater goal. His prayers, if any, were likely for the plan's success, for the bomb's precision, for the devastation he was about to unleash. He was no longer Anders Behring Breivik, a Norwegian citizen. He had become something else, a machine programmed for slaughter, an embodiment of hatred and violence. His first criminal act, though preparatory, marked the complete corruption of a human being. The last flickering light of humanity was extinguished. Only darkness remained, a thick, frigid void, awaiting its moment to erupt, to drown Oslo and Utoya in blood and tears. The silence before the storm, a heavy, ominous silence, heralded an unimaginable tragedy about to unfold. The time at the remote Rena farm was a period of acceleration, a race against the darkness within Anders himself. His preparations were no longer mere plans on paper or vague thoughts. They had become a tangible reality, a death machine being assembled piece by piece with each passing day. He sank deeper into the quagmire of crime, and any semblance of control he might have once had was gone, replaced by a perverse compulsion, an insatiable thirst for blood. Building the bomb became Anders' greatest obsession. He worked with meticulous care, following instructions he had gathered. The barn became a laboratory of death, the acrid stench of chemicals, barrels brimming with ammonium nitrate fertilizer, coils of wire, and detonators all were pieces of a horrific puzzle. He risked blowing himself up in the process, but fear seemed to have been supplanted by a sick exhilaration. He felt like a scientist on the cusp of a grand discovery, except his discovery was annihilation. The only light in the barn came from faint sun rays slipping through cracks or the cold glare of electric bulbs at night. Most of the time, he was immersed in darkness, both literal and figurative. Solitude didn't faze him. It strengthened his resolve. He needed no one, trusted no one. It was just him and his mission. The blood and tears of future victims seemed to hang in the barn's stifling air, but he didn't see or chose not to see. Alongside the bomb-making, Anders continued refining his manifesto, a sprawling 500-page document, a chaotic mix of plagiarized texts, extremist rants, self-aggrandizement, and instructions for a violent revolution. He titled it 2083, a European Declaration of Independence, the year 2083 marking 400 years after the 1683 Battle of Vienna, when Christian forces halted the Ottoman advance. In his warped mind, his impending actions were a similar battle, the start of a war to reclaim Europe from Muslim invaders and multicultural traitors. The farm's silence was occasionally broken by the steady tapping of his keyboard as he obsessively edited and expanded the manifesto. He wrote of the necessity of violence, of martyrdom, of founding a secret military order called the Knights Templar, which he claimed to lead. It was all a product of his diseased imagination, an attempt to cloak himself in the mantle of a leader, a warrior. His prayers, if those venomous words could be called prayers, were calls to hatred, curses aimed at his imagined enemies. His weapons acquisition intensified. Beyond the legally permitted Ruger Mini-14 rifle and Glock pistol, Anders sought additional arms and military gear, exploiting legal loopholes or illegal channels. He ordered body armor, helmets, communication devices, and high-capacity magazines. He transformed himself into a lone soldier, preparing for an asymmetrical war. His reflection in the mirror, clad in full gear, was no longer Anders, the shy Oslo boy, but a cold-blooded warrior, a destroyer. The escalation wasn't limited to material preparations. His mind grew increasingly radical, unhinged. He began using steroids, not just to boost physical strength, but to heighten aggression and resolve. He cut himself off from any dissenting information, consuming only what reinforced his ideology. Any doubt, any hesitation, was deemed weakness, a betrayal of his ideals. In the final months before the attack, Anders lived in a state of extreme tension. He slept little, ate haphazardly, pouring all his energy into completing the plan. He had set a deadline, a day of judgment. Every action was calculated toward that day. He moved chemical barrels, assembled the bomb in a rented van, and prepared a fake police uniform to deceive and approach victims more easily. Out of control. That phrase perfectly captured Anders' state. He was no longer directing the plan. The plan was directing him. He had gone too far to turn back. His pathological ego had consumed him entirely. He believed he was doing something righteous, necessary. No matter how horrific, any inner conflict, if it ever existed, was crushed beneath the boot of fanaticism. Darkness had enveloped him completely. No light could pierce the dense veil of hatred and delusion. He was ready. The bomb was ready. The weapons were ready. The manifesto was ready. All that remained was the moment to unleash terror, to stain Norway's soil with the blood of the innocent. The moment to etch the name Anders Behring Breivik into history, not as the hero he imagined, but as a monster, a mass murderer. The escalation had reached its peak. The wheel of fate had begun to turn. Unstoppable. Silence. A deadly silence, heralding the wrath about to descend. July 22nd, 2011. An ordinary summer day in Oslo. The sky lightly veiled with gray clouds, yet the air carried the serene calm typical of a Nordic nation. Children played in parks, adults hurried to offices or leisurely enjoyed their vacations. No one could have imagined that, in just a few hours, this tranquility would be shattered by a deafening explosion, an explosion that would not only shake buildings, but also strike at the very soul of a nation. It was the fateful blast, the opening act of the darkest day in modern Norwegian history, and the first in a series of heinous crimes committed by Anders Behring Breivik. That morning, Anders drove a white Volkswagen Crafter van, loaded with a nearly 1-ton homemade bomb. From his farm in Rena toward central Oslo, he wore a fake police uniform, a chilling and cunning disguise. His heart likely beat faster not from fear, but from a perverse blend of tension and anticipation. After years of preparation, countless sleepless nights, and relentless secret labor, the moment of action had finally arrived. He saw himself as the lead actor about to step onto the grandest stage of his life, a stage he had constructed with blood and fire. The 140-kilometer journey from Rena to Oslo gave him time to envision the chaos and destruction the bomb would unleash. He didn't think of the innocent lives that would be stolen, nor the unbearable grief of their families. In his warped mind, those working in government buildings were enemies, traitors who had sold out Norway to Islam and multiculturalism. The bomb was more than a weapon. It was a message, a blood-soaked warning he aimed to send to the world. The daylight of Oslo could not dispel the thick darkness within the van or the soul of its driver. He carefully navigated the familiar streets where he had grown up, where fragmented memories lingered. But those memories meant nothing now. He had severed all ties to his past, to his former self. All that remained was the mission, steeped in the red of blood and the black of destruction. At around 3:25 p.m., the van stopped on Grubagata, the street between the Prime Minister's office and the Ministry of Petroleum and Energy, a location meticulously chosen for maximum devastation. Anders calmly stepped out, activated the timed detonator, and swiftly departed in a pre-arranged gray Fiat Doblo. No hesitation, no glance back. He moved like a robot programmed for a single task. Minutes later, a cataclysmic explosion tore through the air. The ground trembled. Windows of surrounding buildings shattered into millions of fragments, like crystalline tears raining onto the streets. A massive black plume of smoke rose, blotting out the sun. The bomb's destructive force was staggering. It ripped apart the facade of the 17-story government building housing the Prime Minister's office, obliterating multiple floors and sparking a massive fire. Nearby, government structures suffered severe damage. Screams, alarms, and wailing ambulance sirens filled the air. Chaos reigned. Survivors, faces smeared with blood and dust, scrambled in panic to escape. The scene resembled a war zone. Blood stained the pavement and crumbled walls. Tears mingled with ash. The silence of a peaceful summer afternoon was replaced by the cries of pain and terror. 8 people died instantly or soon after from grievous wounds. Over 200 others were injured, many bearing physical and emotional scars that would never heal. These were Anders' first victims, innocent people, working, living their lives, suddenly robbed of existence or thrust into an inescapable nightmare. They were civil servants, office workers, passers-by, not combatants in Anders' imagined holy war. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. As Oslo descended into chaos and grief, Anders drove out of the city, heading northwest to the ferry for Utoya. He listened to news of the blast on the radio, likely with a sick sense of satisfaction. Phase 1 of his plan had succeeded, but this was only the beginning. The true massacre, his primary target, lay ahead. The fateful explosion in Oslo was not a standalone act of terrorism. It was part of a larger scheme to sow chaos, weaken the government, and pave the way for his revolution. He believed the blast would divert police resources to the city center, making his second attack easier. A cold, ruthless calculation, devoid of any consideration for the human toll. The light of justice and humanity seemed utterly eclipsed by the darkness of his crime that day. Oslo wept. Norway reeled. The world stood stunned. No one could believe such a tragedy could strike a nation renowned for peace and stability. Yet it had, and the perpetrator, a man with a seemingly ordinary face, was en route to commit the next slaughter. His heart turned to stone. The prayers of the victims, of Oslo's people, were for life, for peace, for help. Anders' prayers, if any, remained pleas for destruction, for the success of his atrocities. Blood had been spilled, tears had fallen, and the darkness had not yet lifted. The explosion in Oslo was merely the prelude to a symphony of death. After the cataclysmic explosion in Oslo, Anders Behring Breivik did not pause. He donned the perfect mask of authority, a calculated deception crafted to every detail, to continue his path of atrocities. The gray Fiat Doblo sped along the highway, carrying a demon in human guise toward the island of Utoya. There, the Labour Party's youth summer camp was in full swing, gathering hundreds of young people brimming with ideals, aspirations, and faith in a brighter future. They were unaware that a lethal shadow was approaching, poised to extinguish their dreams and drown the peaceful island in blood and tears. Anders had meticulously studied the Utoya camp. He knew it was a hub for young members of the Labour Party, which he viewed as his primary enemy, responsible for the multicultural policies he despised in his warped mind. Attacking these youths wasn't the murder of innocent children, but a punishment of the future generation of traitors, a severing of the roots of betrayal, a perverse, ruthless justification that transcended all bounds of humanity. He arrived at the mainland ferry dock, where the MS Thorbjørn shuttled passengers to the island, still in his fake police uniform, with a stern face and confident demeanor. He told the ferry operator he was dispatched to secure the island following the Oslo bombing. He carried a rifle, a handgun, and a bag stuffed with ammunition. His lies were so seamless that no one questioned him. Amid the chaos and anxiety after the bombing, the presence of a police officer seemed to offer reassurance, a sense of protection and agonizing irony. Anders's mask was flawless. He concealed the bloodthirsty demon within under the guise of a public servant. His eyes, cold and devoid of emotion, betrayed no hint of the madness raging in his chest. He had rehearsed this role, steeled himself to face his victims. To him, they weren't human, just targets, numbers in his plan. As the ferry slowly pulled away from the dock, gliding across the clear waters of Lake Tirafjorden, Anders likely gazed at Utoya with a sense of triumph. The small, tree-shaded island, alive with the laughter and songs of youth, was about to become the stage for the most horrific massacre. The contrast between the serene beauty of nature and the sinister intent of this man was chilling. Sunlight sparkled on the lake, but it couldn't penetrate the darkness of the killer's soul. He stepped onto the island, maintaining his calm, professional facade. He requested everyone gather, claiming he needed to share critical updates about the Oslo explosion. The youths, still reeling from the news from the capital, trusted the man in the police uniform. They assembled, naive and defenseless. They couldn't imagine that the figure before them was not a protector, but death incarnate. In that moment, Anders's double life reached the peak of its deceit. On one hand, he was the terrorist who had bombed Oslo, driven by hatred and a lust for killing. On the other, he was a police officer calming and controlling the situation. Two personas coexisted in one body, a terrifying split in character. Blood had already spilled in Oslo, and now it was about to flow on this island. Tears would soon fall, not from bomb dust, but from the cruel impact of bullets. A heavy silence hung before the storm. The youths listened, waiting. Anders looked at them, perhaps with a cold smile hidden behind his stern expression. He had his prey in his grasp. He had breached their final defenses. Nothing could stop him now. The prayers of the young people on Utoya, if they had time to pray, were likely for the safety of family and friends in Oslo. For peace. They didn't know they were the ones most in need of prayers. Anders didn't pray. He acted. He prepared to draw his weapons, to transform this island paradise into a living hell. His double life, his perfect mask, had brought him within reach of his ultimate goal, a brutal deception, a horrific betrayal of trust. Darkness had entirely shrouded his reason and humanity. He was no longer human. He was a killing machine, programmed by hatred and fanaticism, and Utoya, the island of youth and hope, was about to witness the wrath of that machine. As the youths on Utoya gathered, trusting the man in the police uniform, Anders Bering Breivik abruptly drew his weapons. The Ruger Mini 14 rifle and Glock handgun in his hands were no longer mere props from the shooting club. They became instruments of death, poised to sow carnage. A piercing gunshot shattered the silence, shredding trust and crushing tender hopes. Blood began to flow. Tears began to fall. Utoya, a paradise island, in an instant transformed into a hell on earth, an island of blood and tears. Panic gripped the youths. Screams of terror echoed across the island. They couldn't comprehend what was happening. The man they believed to be their protector had become their executioner. Shock and abject fear overwhelmed them. They ran, desperately seeking escape, any place to hide. But the island was too small, and the killer too merciless. Anders moved methodically, coldly, like a predator stalking prey. He fired at anyone in sight, indiscriminate of gender or age. To him, all were enemies, mere targets. Each shot was a dagger to Norway's soul, sowing unimaginable trauma. He advanced from the main building, where many had gathered, to the campsite, then to the shoreline, hunting those trying to swim to safety. The scene was horrific. Blood stained the grass, rocks, and earth. Bodies lay scattered. Cries, moans, and pleas for mercy filled the air. But Anders was unmoved. He was a machine programmed for slaughter. He even lured out those in hiding, shouting that the police had arrived, that they were safe only to gun them down when they emerged. An unthinkable cruelty. The summer sun's light seemed to pale, powerless against the bloodbath. The darkness of hatred and madness enveloped the island. Youths who, hours earlier, had been laughing, singing, and sharing dreams now faced death. Many bravely tried to shield friends, but against the killer's gunfire, they were defenseless. Some made frantic calls for help, their trembling, desperate voices describing the horror as shots rang out relentlessly. Those calls became final farewells, heart-wrenching cries for aid, tears of parents, friends, and loved ones on the other end mingled with those of the victims on the island. The massacre stretched over an hour and eternity for those fleeing. Watching friends fall, Anders reloaded multiple times, continuing his brutal hunt. He seemed tireless, fearless, wholly consumed by a bloodlust. Among the countless personal tragedies on Utoya that day, certain moments likely seared into Anders' warped psyche, not as remorse, but as a twisted sense of success in his deranged plan. Perhaps the image of a group of youths hiding behind a rock, whom he coldly dispatched, or the desperate eyes of a victim in the split second before he pulled the trigger. These scenes, rather than staying his hand, seemed to fuel his fanaticism, reinforcing his belief that he was purging those he deemed deserving of death. Any flicker of inner conflict, if it ever existed, was now obliterated, crushed under the heel of violence. He had crossed every human boundary. He no longer felt others' pain or valued life. He was the embodiment of pure evil. Finally, when the Delta Special Forces unit reached the island after inexplicable delays, Anders surrendered without resistance. He had run out of ammunition, or perhaps felt his mission was complete. As he was handcuffed, his face remained impassive, devoid of emotion, as if he had just finished a routine task. Utoya, the island of youth, became a grave for 69 lives, mostly teenagers, combined with the 8 killed in Oslo. Anders Behring Breivik murdered 77 people in a single day, an unimaginable toll. Blood and tears stained a Norwegian summer day, leaving a scar that would never heal. The trauma of Utoya would haunt Norway and the world for years to come. The image of innocent youths brutally slaughtered would never fade. The prayers of survivors and victims' families were for justice, remembrance, and a world free of violence and hatred. Anders would face the judgment of the law and perhaps, if he still possessed one, the judgment of his conscience. After his arrest on Utoya, amid the devastation and chaos, Anders Behring Breivik was taken away. His hands, moments ago stained with the blood of dozens of innocent lives, were now tightly cuffed. He offered no resistance, his face maintaining an eerie, almost emotionless calm, as if the horrors he had unleashed were merely a performance he had directed and starred in. Now concluded as scripted, the outside world, the world of law and social order he had sought to destroy, now enveloped him. But within his mind, another chase, a confrontation with intangible specters, may have begun to stir. In the early days of his detention, facing long interrogations, Anders displayed a strangely cooperative demeanor. He recounted his plan in meticulous detail, from preparing the bomb and acquiring weapons to the sequence of the attacks in Oslo and Utoya. He showed no remorse. Instead, he took pride in his actions, deeming them necessary and just to save Europe. He proclaimed himself a commander of an imaginary Knights Templar organization, insisting his acts were merely the prelude to a greater war. Yet, as the initial sick euphoria faded, as the cell's walls became familiar, as the silence of night was no longer broken by gunfire or screams, but by faint echoes of his own crimes, an unease, an indescribable disquiet began to creep into Anders's mind. It wasn't conventional remorse or repentance for the lives he had stolen. It was a vague sense that something was watching him. Perhaps it came in nightmares. The terror-stricken faces of his victims haunted his sleep, not seeking justice, but as relentless, indelible images. The pleading eyes of a young girl before he fired, the desperate cry of a boy trying to swim away. These visions, though he tried to banish them, infiltrated his most vulnerable moments, when the fortress of his fanaticism showed cracks, or perhaps it was strange sounds in the night, whispers with no source, soft footsteps outside his cell door. Though he knew no one was there, his senses grew unnaturally sharp, as if probing for an unseen threat. He, once the hunter, now felt hunted. The solitude of his cell, once a necessary space for plotting, now bred amorphous fears. No longer could he seek validation from online forums or extremist texts to bolster his beliefs. It was just him, four walls, and blood-soaked memories. The darkness of the cell ceased to be a safe refuge and became a realm where phantoms of his past could freely materialize. He began exhibiting odd behaviors. He scanned his surroundings with heightened caution. Attuned to the slightest sounds, he could spend hours staring at a blank spot on the wall, as if trying to peer through it, searching for something lurking. Tears not of regret, but perhaps of strain, of a nameless fear sometimes welled in his eyes. Any inner turmoil wasn't a battle between good and evil, but a clash between his pathological, arrogant ego and a primal fear, a sense of punishment by some incomprehensible supernatural force. He, who saw himself as a rational warrior driven by iron logic, now felt powerless against something beyond his understanding. His prayers, if they could be called that, were no longer for the success of his mission. They might have been incoherent mutterings, attempts to ward off specters, to reassure himself, or perhaps a silent defiance of the thing watching him, an assertion that he was unafraid, though deep within. Unease gnawed at him. The belief that something was watching could have been the product of a guilty mind beginning to fracture under the weight of isolation and the enormity of his deeds. Or it might have been the echo of a conscience he had tried to bury but couldn't fully extinguish, resurfacing in a distorted, haunting form. For those who believe in the spiritual, it could have been the souls of his victims, their wordless lamentations reaching out to the one who caused their pain. Whatever it was, the conviction that something was watching marked a shift in Anders's demeanor. The initial confidence, the arrogance of a victor, began to erode. He still didn't admit guilt in the way the world expected, but a new fear, a profound unease, took root. The darkness outside his cell seemed to mirror the darkness within, and in that darkness, terrifying shapes began to form. The spiritual chase had truly begun. The legal process began, and Anders Behring Breivik, the mass murderer, was brought before the bar of justice. But for him, physical confinement, the cold concrete walls of the prison, the watchful eyes of the guards seemed not to be the most terrifying ordeal. A different, invisible yet palpable horror enveloped him, especially in the solitary moments of the night. It was the shadow in the dark, an undefined entity, a presence he felt but could not explain, a primal fear far beyond the punishments of the law. During the months of detention awaiting trial, Anders' mental state grew increasingly unstable. The initial cold confidence occasionally crumbled under sudden bouts of panic, revealing an unconcealable fear. He complained of psychological harassment, of strange noises, of the sensation that someone was watching him, even in the isolation of his cell. Guards might have noted these behaviors as signs of mental breakdown or an attempt to feign insanity to evade accountability. But for Anders, the fear was real. The shadow in the dark wasn't always present. It came and went unpredictably, often at his most vulnerable moments when darkness blanketed the cell, when silence became suffocating. Sometimes he felt a chilling breeze pass through, though windows and doors were sealed. Other times, he heard indistinct whispers, like wind hissing through a crack, yet carrying an eerie, spectral tone, as if the voices of restless souls. The cell's only light, whether from a stark bulb or faint moonlight through a small window, couldn't dispel the shadow. Instead, it made the dark corners more sinister, where his imagination conjured ghastly shapes. He fought to stay awake, dreading that sleep would bring the shadow closer, invading his mind. Tears, born not just of fear but of helplessness, sometimes streaked his face in the darkness. The inner turmoil was no longer about ideology or his mission. It was a struggle to cling to sanity, to avoid being consumed by an intangible terror. He, who had taken 77 lives without flinching, now trembled before something he couldn't see, touch, or shoot, a cruel irony of fate. In meetings with his lawyer and psychologists, Anders might have maintained a facade of calm rationality, reiterating his rhetoric about fighting multiculturalism. But back in the solitude of his cell, that defense collapsed. He couldn't share his fear with anyone who would believe him, who could understand that the cold-blooded killer was haunted by phantoms. His prayers, if any, during those sleepless nights, were likely desperate pleas, not to God or any higher power, but to the shadow tormenting him. Leave me alone, a silent cry in his mind, or perhaps curses, an attempt to mask fear with anger, to banish the dread. But the shadow lingered, lurking, waiting. The law's net was inescapable. The evidence against him was irrefutable. But for Anders, the looming trial and society's judgment were no longer his greatest concern. His true battle was surviving the endless nights, confronting the shadow that tormented him relentlessly. The blood had dried on Oslo's streets and Utoya's grass, but its vivid image persisted in Anders' mind, perhaps fueling the shadow in the dark. Each victim was part of that shadow, each desperate scream an indelible sound. He tried to shut his ears, close his eyes, but his crimes were too vast to hide or forget. The silence of the cell was no longer peaceful, but the silence of a tomb, where unavenged spirits whispered accusations. He had sown the wind and now reaped the whirlwind, not just the storm of earthly justice, but the tempest of unseen forces, the spiritual consequences of an unforgivable crime. The shadow in the dark was a punishment more terrifying than a life sentence. It was an internal torment, a constant reminder of his deeds. It was absolute solitude, not for lack of company, but because no one could share or comprehend the horror he endured. He was caught, imprisoned. But more fearsome than the prison bars was the shadow dancing in his mind, a dance of death, an unending curse. The trial of Anders Behring Breivik began in April 2012, nearly a year after the tragedy. Norway and the world watched with bated breath. It was not just an ordinary criminal trial, where justice was served and crimes punished. For many, especially survivors and the families of the deceased, it held a deeper significance, akin to a spiritual judgment. Here, not only were Anders' actions dissected, but his warped ideology and dark motives were laid bare under the unrelenting light of truth and pain. Anders entered the courtroom, no longer in his fake police uniform or self-styled warrior garb, dressed in a formal suit. He strove to appear calm and composed, at times offering a strange smile or performing a far-right salute. He sought to turn the trial into a stage to propagate his rhetoric, to justify the unjustifiable. He didn't see himself as a defendant, but as a visionary, a warrior oppressed by the system. But the courtroom was not a political forum. It was a place where truth was upheld, where pain was heard. Prosecutors presented irrefutable evidence security footage of him planting the bomb in Oslo, testimonies from Utoya survivors, autopsy reports of the 77 victims. Each detail struck like a hammer, not only at Anders, but at the conscience of all present. The courtroom's artificial light seemed to possess the power to dispel the darkness Anders had sown. Images of the victims were displayed young, vibrant faces now mere memories, stories of their lives and unfulfilled dreams, shared by loved ones, silenced the room. Blood and tears, the haunting hallmarks of his crimes, were now vividly present, undeniable. For Anders, confronting the direct consequences of his actions, the pain he inflicted, may have been a greater challenge than the shadows in the dark. He might have maintained a cold facade, but no one could know what truly stirred in his mind. Was there a flicker of remorse, a struggle between his pathological ego and a faint remnant of conscience? The trial also saw conflicting psychological evaluations of Anders' mental state. Was he a paranoid schizophrenic, unfit to bear criminal responsibility, or was he fully aware, acting on a calculated extremist ideology? This question became a focal point, as it not only determined his sentence, but shaped society's understanding of the nature of evil. During the trial, Anders was allowed to speak in his defense. Presenting his views, he delivered a lengthy speech, reiterating his claims of an Islamic invasion, the betrayal of elites, and the necessity of violence. But these words, though articulated clearly, only underscored his derangement and detachment from reality. No longer confined to online rants or a secret manifesto, they were spoken before those he had harmed, before a grieving nation. The silence in the courtroom was sometimes more terrifying than the accusations. It was the silence of victims who could no longer speak, the silence of inexpressible pain. And in that silence, Anders likely felt the weight of his crimes, an invisible but crushing burden. The prayers of those in the courtroom and following via media were for justice, truth, and healing. They sought not vengeance, but closure, an end to this dark chapter. So the process of mending could begin for Anders. The trial was not a spiritual judgment in the sense of finding redemption or forgiveness. It was an exposure, a revealing of his brutality, the emptiness of his ideology, and the isolation of a man who had placed himself beyond law and morality. The shadow in the dark might still haunt him in his cell, but in the courtroom, another shadow loomed, the shadow of his named, proven, and globally recognized crimes, no longer vague fears, but stark, undeniable truth. In the end, the court delivered its verdict. Anders Behring Breivik was convicted and sentenced to Norway's maximum penalty, 21 years in prison, extendable if he remained a threat to society, a sentence to protect the community, but for many, no punishment could compensate for the immense loss. The trial ended, but Anders' internal struggle, his confrontation with his own phantoms, likely persisted. The legal judgment was complete, but the judgment of conscience, of unseen forces, may still unfold in the darkness of his prison cell. The verdict delivered. The courtroom doors closed, and Anders Behring Breivik began an interminable existence within the four walls of Ila prison, a maximum security facility near Oslo. The clamor of the trial, the media's glare, the confrontations with prosecutors and witnesses all faded into the past. Now, there was only him and the silence, a silence wholly unlike that of the Reyna farm, where he hatched his criminal plans, or the eerie quiet of his pretrial cell, haunted by formless shadows. This was the silence of punishment, of absolute solitude, an unspoken sentence that seeped into his flesh, into every crevice of his soul. Ila prison, though designed to meet humanitarian standards, remained a prison: cold concrete walls, unyielding iron bars, strict regulations. Anders was confined in an isolated wing, completely separated from other inmates for his safety and theirs. He had 3 small rooms, a bedroom, a study, and a gym, a luxury for many prisoners, but for Anders, an expanded cage, an island of loneliness. Natural light filtered through small, bulletproof windows, but it lacked the power to dispel the inner darkness of his crimes, his hatred, his obsessions, daily. He was allowed into a fenced outdoor yard to breathe fresh air. Yet even Norway's clear skies above offered no sense of freedom. He was a caged bird, a trapped beast, no matter the cage's comforts. The silence of the prison was a profound challenge. Gone were the sounds of the outside world, the online debates, the goals that once focused his attention. Only the footsteps of guards, the clink of keys, the echoes of his own thoughts remained in that silence. Memories of July 22nd, 2011 surged, unbidden, relentless undercurrents, carrying images of blood, tears, and terrified faces. He tried to fill the silence with routine, reading books, writing letters, exercising, taking correspondence courses. He clung to his extremist ideas, attempting to spread them through heavily censored letters, still viewing himself as a political prisoner, a captive warrior. But deep down, he may have sensed the futility, the despair of life behind bars. His prayers, if any, were no longer defiant challenges or pleas to phantoms. They might have been self-questioning, unanswerable queries about the meaning of existence, of his crimes, of his punishment, or perhaps he no longer prayed. Faith in his mission may have waned, giving way to an empty, inescapable disquiet. Any lingering inner conflict was a struggle between maintaining the image of a resolute warrior and confronting the brutal truth that he was merely a murderer, responsible for irreparable pain. He could blame society, multiculturalism, anything external, but in the prison's solitude, he couldn't forever escape himself. The shadow in the dark may still have lingered, now melding with the prison's silence to create a heavy, stifling atmosphere. Every faint sound, every shift in light could stir latent fears. He lived in constant vigilance, not just of the outside world, but of the hidden corners of his own mind. Time crawled, monotonous. Days bled into weeks, weeks into years. The 21-year sentence felt like an eternity, with the possibility of extension if he remained a threat, a bleak, inescapable future. The prison's silence wasn't one of peace, but of waiting. Waiting for what? Forgiveness, redemption, or simply the end of a misguided, sinful life. Anders didn't know. He only knew he was trapped not just by walls and bars, but by his own crimes, a burden he'd carry until his last breath. This solitary sentence was not merely physical isolation, it was spiritual, emotional solitude. He had severed himself from humanity through his atrocities. Now, he faced the consequences of that choice in the prison's silence and loneliness, light and darkness, blood and tears, silence and prayer. These were no longer external contrasts, but internal battles, raging within the captive soul of Anders Behring Breivik. Years passed in the solitude and silence of Villa prison. Anders Behring Breivik, the mass murderer, continued his isolated existence, with cold, concrete walls as his only companions. He clung to routines, reading, writing, exercising in a desperate bid to keep his mind from plunging into the abyss of despair. Yet the darkness of his crimes loomed ever present, and the blood-soaked memories of July 22, 2011 resurfaced unbidden, relentless. Then, one day, amid the monotonous, bleak routine, a solitary ray of light pierced through, not from the narrow cell window, but from an unexpected source. It might have been a letter, not the hate-filled missives or threats occasionally intercepted by guards, nor the letters from extremist supporters he deemed comrades. Instead, it was a letter from a stranger, perhaps someone who had endured their own tragedy or carried a deep faith in forgiveness and compassion. Or perhaps the light came from a book, not the extremist political texts or war histories he typically read, but a spiritual work, a literary classic about repentance and redemption, or a poetry collection that touched the deepest recesses of the human soul. The book might have been left by a guard, slipped in by chance, or sent by a religious organization. Whatever its form, this encounter with a bearer of light, even if only through written words, planted a strange new seed in Anders's barren soul. Not a seed of hatred or violence, but of something he had long forgotten, or perhaps never truly known: empathy, remorse, and, maybe, a fragile glimmer of hope for change. At first, Anders likely dismissed it. He was too accustomed to fortifying his defenses, too used to scorning human values. He might have sneered at notions of love or forgiveness, branding them as weakness or deceit. But those words, that message, somehow reached a buried place within him, a place even his fanaticism and violence couldn't fully erase. Perhaps the letter didn't condemn or judge him. It might have simply shared a story of loss, pain, and the journey to find peace after tragedy. Or the book might have depicted a character who committed grave wrongs, but ultimately found a path to atonement, not by justifying the past, but by confronting it and accepting responsibility. This faint light began to illuminate the darkest corners of Anders's mind. It didn't banish the darkness instantly, but it created patches of light and shadow, contrasts that forced him to reassess everything. Images of Oslo and Utoya ceased to be mere triumphs in his war. They emerged with painful clarity: the victims' faces, the terror in their eyes, the devastation he wrought. Blood and tears were no longer abstract concepts, but vivid images tied to real people. The silence of his cell was no longer just isolation. It began to carry new echoes, faint whispers of conscience. His prayers, once warped if they existed, might have started to take a different form: a search, a questioning. This encounter with the bearer of light was no miracle that transformed Anders overnight. It was merely a beginning, a tiny crack in the icy wall he had built around himself. But that crack, however small, allowed light to seep through. The inner turmoil grew more complex. It was no longer just fear of spectral shadows or a struggle to uphold his diseased ego. It became a battle between the old self, steeped in hatred and violence, and a new possibility, a different path, however vague. He might have felt anger at himself for succumbing to these weak emotions. He might have tried to reject them, retreating to familiar extremist rhetoric. But the seed was sown, quietly sprouting in the darkness. This solitary light might not be enough to redeem Anders, but it opened a door, if only slightly, to another possibility, the possibility of reflection, of feeling, and perhaps of repentance. His spiritual journey, if it could be called that, entered a new phase, uncertain, fraught with challenges, but no longer entirely submerged in hopeless darkness. The solitary ray of light from that letter or book, initially just a faint spark, began to spread slowly but steadily through Anders' mind. It didn't instantly burn away the thick veil of fanaticism and hatred, but it warmed the cold, hidden corners, gradually melting the ice that had encased his heart for so long. The silence of his cell ceased to be merely a terrifying void. It became a space for reflection, a place to confront himself, his sinful memories, and, for the first time, a true confession, not for the courts or the media, but to his own conscience, began to take shape. This process was far from easy. It was painful, wrenching. Anders had to battle the arrogant, pathological ego entrenched within him. That ego relentlessly sought to justify his crimes, blaming circumstances, society, anything but himself. It whispered that he was a warrior, a victim of an unjust system, that his actions were necessary. But the fragile light cast a different truth, one he had long denied, the truth of the immense pain he had caused, the innocent lives he had stolen. He began to revisit his memories, not through the lens of a self-styled terrorist, but through the eyes of a man slowly awakening, his lonely childhood, personal grievances, descent into extremist ideology, meticulous planning of the atrocities, the deafening explosion in Oslo, and the blood-soaked massacre on Utoya, each painful fragment resurfaced, no longer as hazy images or proud victories, but as raw, aching scars on his soul. Light and darkness waged a fierce battle in his mind. At times, darkness seemed to prevail as he sank back into hateful thoughts, donning the armor of apathy. But the light crept in, reminding him of something else. Blood and tears ceased to be symbols of his war. They became the reality of his victims. He started to envision their faces not as nameless enemies, but as people, children, youths with dreams, hopes, and love. He began to feel, even if only faintly, the anguish of their families, the irreparable loss. This was no sudden epiphany, but a slow, gnawing process. Each day, he spent more time thinking, remembering. The books he once deemed truth now felt empty, meaningless. The extremist rhetoric he had believed in revealed its absurdity and cruelty. A confession took root in the silence not spoken for others, but a reckoning with himself. I was wrong. I committed an unforgivable crime. I caused immeasurable pain. At first, these were fleeting thoughts, but they grew clearer, stronger. The inner turmoil reached its peak. On one side, the demon of his past clung to him. On the other, a new self struggled to emerge, burdened by guilt but faintly yearning for redemption. Despite knowing it was unattainable, some nights, Anders couldn't sleep. He sat in the darkness, tears streaming down his face, not from fear of shadows, but from remorse, from anguish. He felt disgust for himself, for what he had done. He wanted to scream, to lash out, but could only sit, powerless, facing the stark truth of his crimes. His prayers, if they could be called that, were no longer incoherent mutterings. They might have been whispers in the night, belated apologies to victims he could never face again. Forgive me, if you can. This process of reflection and confession didn't lighten his burden. If anything, it made it heavier, as he now fully grasped the horror of his actions. Yet it also brought a strange sensation, almost relief. For at last, he had dared to face the truth, to name his crimes. The solitary light achieved what no verdict or punishment could. It touched Anders' conscience, awakening the possibility of repentance. The road ahead remained long and dark, but he was no longer wholly submerged in the abyss of apathy and fanaticism. The belated confession, even if only to himself, was the first step on an uncertain journey, a search for a shred of peace, for a soul once utterly lost. The silent confession to himself, the sleepless nights wrestling with the weight of remorse, gradually reshaped Anders from within. That initial solitary ray of light, whether from a letter or a book, paved the way for a deeper transformation. a yearning for something beyond the prison walls and his sinful past. And then, in the profound solitude and silence of his cell, at the depths of despair and the belated realization of his crimes, Anders Behring Breivik, the man who once sowed terror, uttered a true prayer for the first time in his life. It wasn't the incoherent mutterings to ward off phantoms, nor the curses or self-justifications of his old, warped ideology. This was a different prayer, born from a broken heart, a soul writhing in the agony of truth. He didn't pray to the gods of extremism or the warriors of his delusions. This time, his prayer reached toward an unseen divine, a presence he may never have truly believed in or understood. But now, in utter helplessness, he sought as a final refuge. It might have been a late night, with faint moonlight spilling through the small window, casting a pale glow on the cold floor, or perhaps an early morning, as the first rays of dawn broke, carrying a fragile hint of hope. Anders knelt, not following any formal religious ritual he'd been taught, but driven by an instinctive urge from within. His hands might have been clenched tightly or clasped awkwardly. Tears may have streamed down his face again, but this time, they were tears of surrender, of earnest supplication. His prayer likely lacked clear words, not polished verses or memorized scriptures. It might have been choked sobs, whispers from the depths of his soul. "O God, if you exist, look upon me, a sinner, a monster." He didn't beg forgiveness for his crimes, knowing their magnitude made absolution unthinkable, nor did he plead for release from prison or a lighter sentence. What he sought, perhaps, was a sliver of peace for his tormented soul, a bit of strength to face the days ahead, and maybe some understanding of the meaning behind it all. Light and darkness still coexisted, but in this moment of prayer, a fragile reconciliation emerged. He no longer denied the darkness or chased the false light. He accepted both as parts of himself, of his life. The blood and tears of his victims remained an inescapable burden, but now, instead of suppressing or justifying them, he carried them in his prayer, a constant reminder of the brutality of hatred and violence. He prayed for their souls to find peace, for their families to find solace. Though he knew the prayers of a murderer might hold no weight, the silence of the cell was no longer terrifying. It became a sacred space, where he could connect with something greater than himself. His prayer was a delicate thread, linking him to a spiritual realm he had once scorned and rejected. This was Anders' first true prayer, born from a place of utter brokenness and absolute humility. Gone was the arrogant ego, the delusions of power or mission. Only a raw, vulnerable human remained, seeking a flicker of hope, a shred of meaning in the ashes of his life. The inner turmoil persisted, but it was no longer a futile battle. It became part of a journey toward redemption. However distant or dim the path, prayer wasn't a magic wand to erase the past or alter the future, but it gave Anders a quiet strength to keep living, to keep facing himself. In that moment, he might have felt a strange peace, not from absolution, but from accepting his guilt and surrendering to a higher power. The prayer from the abyss was a faint cry, but it was the truest cry of a soul yearning for healing. No matter how deep the wounds, it marked a pivotal turning point in his inner journey, a shift towards something, however unclear, not entirely shrouded in darkness. Years slipped quietly by after that heartfelt prayer from the abyss. Anders Behring Breivik aged within the four walls of his prison cell, his once dark hair now streaked with silver. The silence ceased to be an enemy or a torturous void, gradually becoming a companion, a thin blanket draped over wounds that would never fully heal. The nightmares and phantoms of his past grew less ferocious, giving way to a quiet, pervasive sadness, a silent acceptance. He no longer raged against his fate or sought to justify his undeniable crimes. Instead, he found a slow, simple rhythm to his existence. The faint morning light no longer sparked fear, but served as a reminder of a new day, another chance to breathe, to reflect, to carry his burden quietly. Spiritual books remained his companions, their words like cool droplets soothing the smoldering fire of remorse. The blood and tears of that fateful day never fully faded from his memory, but they no longer assaulted him with raw torment. They settled into a deep, abiding sorrow, a constant reminder of life's fragility and hatred's brutality. His prayers were no longer desperate cries, but gentle whispers, an inner dialogue with an unseen presence, seeking not forgiveness, but a sliver of fragile peace. Then, one day, in that same silence, Anders' breath grew faint. There was no drama, no wrenching physical pain, just a gradual fading, like a candle burning to its end. He lay alone in his cell, but for perhaps the first time in years, his face was free of fear or torment. A strange peace, a final acceptance, settled over his weathered features. The last light of a fading afternoon filtered into the room, soft and unharsh. His final breath escaped, a quiet sigh after an exhausting journey, solitary, but perhaps not entirely hopeless. A tranquil departure, closing a chapter of turmoil and sin,